Good evening from Fiji. My name is Maureen Penjueli, and I will be moderating tonight's deep dive with my colleague, Sean Owens, who is based in the Netherlands. On behalf of the Deep Sea Conservation Coalition, WWF, and the Pacific Network on Globalisation, we welcome our four amazing panelists in the order that they will be speaking tonight. First, Debbie Ngarewa Paka, co-leader of the Maori Party, and Kairataki, leader of Ngati Ranui Iwi from Aotearoa, New Zealand. Our second panelist is Honorable Ralph Reagan Vanu, Member of Parliament, opposition leader from Vanuatu. Dr. Matthias Heikel, Geomar Helmut's Center for Ocean Research, is the coordinator of the European project looking into mining impacts on environment and risks of deep sea mining, joins us from Germany. And finally, Zaid Raad Al-Hussein from Perry World, House Professor of the Practice of Law and Human Rights from the University of Pennsylvania. A very big thank you to World Economic Forum and Friends of Ocean Action for enabling this event to take place against the backdrop of a global pandemic and climate emergency. And a very, very warm welcome to all of you, our participants. First, some housekeeping rules. When you enter the virtual conference space, for participants, your microphones and cameras will be disabled by the organizers to allow for a smooth interface with the virtual platform. We encourage you to pose written questions throughout the session. Sean Owens will moderate the Q&A session once the panelists have all finished. The topic, deep sea mining, is perhaps one of the most urgent and contentious issues on oceans. Each of our panelists will take us through considering the current context of DSM, traversing the key issues of whether DSM is appropriate today. While DSM is an emerging global industry, its launching point is here in the Pacific Island countries. Hailed as a new global gold rush, DSM means harvesting mineral deposits in the deep sea, approximately 4,000 to 6,000 meters deep, but questions of whether it should go ahead. Presented as low risk with high but unsubstantiated economic returns, some governments and companies have scrambled to obtain exploration contracts for vast tracts of both national and international seabed, ignoring the experimental nature of mining and its impacts. The International Seabed Authority has issued 30 exploration contracts, the majority of those contracts in an area known as the Clarion-Clipperton Fracture Zone. 4 Pacific Island nations, Cook Islands, Kiribati, Nauru, and Tonga, are now sponsoring states. Once thought of as an ecological desert, scientific research is revealing that it is brimming with wonderful and unique life forms, much of which is still yet to be discovered. The Clipperton Zone is set to become the largest contested mining site in the world. But the new rush shares many features with past resource grabs, including disregard of environmental and social impacts, the marginalization and violations of indigenous peoples, communities, citizens, and their rights. For Pacific Islanders, our sacred relationship with the ocean frames a community response and resistance to seabed mining on why DSM should not go ahead in the Pacific. There is now a call to heed caution by some island nations, notably Fiji, Vanuatu, and PNG, for a pause, a moratorium on DSM. With these remarks, I would like to really say a big mahalo to Hawaiian artist Joy Enomoto for sharing her artworks on the Nautilus, an ancient and a protector. Joy's work invites us to ask the central question: if we drill a hole through our beginnings, where will we be in the end? And with that, I would like to invite our first panelist to please take the floor. Debbie, the floor is yours.
Kia ora, tēnā koutou katoa, nei rā te mihi mai mō ngā taranaki ai ki te mana o te whenua. I come from an area in Aotearoa, New Zealand, on the west coast within South Taranaki, known as Aotea. As Aotea people, we come from the ocean, the water. We were raised learning te waha ātai. Te waha ātai, which means the mouth of the tide, what we call the font of creation. For us, the universal creation of all things starts in a liquid state. It's the same for the creation of humanity. All land came out of the ocean. Volcanoes come out of the ocean. Our land, our whenua, Aotearoa, New Zealand, was birthed from the ocean. As children, we are conceived from liquid as semen and surrounded in the fluid in the womb of our mother. Our body is 80% fluid, and like the ocean, these fluids are salty, our urine, our blood, and mucus. And the relationship of our bodies and our environments are dependent on the ocean. For us, as tangata whenua, the fluid of life. Our ocean is us. It sustains what feeds us spiritually, physically, and psychologically. We culturally believe we have 7 atua, the gods, the beings of creation, in our body. And their relationship too connects to our ocean. Together these create the balance of our universe and our very being. And the moment this balance is lost, so too is the balance of our lives and the lives of our future. So based on our beliefs within the ocean is the seabed. And the seabed is our Mother Earth, who we call papatuanuku. And if she's disrupted or desecrated unnaturally, so too is the ocean, and as are we. It creates an imbalance which for us grows like a tumour or a cancer, which has no cure. If we let our Mother Earth and our ocean be desecrated, we're also letting everything connected to it be destroyed, our own being, our own future grandchildren. We impact ourselves and lose our ability to be well and lose our ability to self-heal. Again, not only in this generation, but in the future as well. Included in the ocean is the vibration of our life. It's the same type of vibration our babies feel in the womb, that hum when we carry them. Within this vibration, our babies learn and grow and feel loved, as to within our ocean, all life grows and thrives and feels the natural vibration and the harmonisation of life. We culturally use this vibration when we do karakia, which is known as prayer, and we use a certain tone of vibration to lift grief off our whānau who are who've lost loved ones, or to pass on safe passage for those going on a journey. It's a tone of vibration that we use in our haka when we are giving out strength and courage to be bold. This is our natural order and has been practiced for thousands of years since our creation. And when the vibrations and the seabed shifts, we live in a way that no one else does. We've seen extreme deaths of whale along our coast. As an oceans people, we're very mindful of this connection and the responsibility as guardians, or kaitiaki as we call them in our culture. We have a natural DNA. We have suffered, like many Indigenous peoples, with displacement, the loss of our natural environment, forcibly removed from our lands, confiscated, waters polluted, over-extracted. And we are within our country the race of people that most are sick, the most dying, the most poor. And to guard our ocean is more than a passion of environmental conservation. It is in fact a matter of life, a matter of our future life. If the ocean is destroyed, so too are we. So we have no option but to stop and to be kaitiaki and to be opposed to seabed mining, because it destroys our ocean, our Mother Earth, and it will destroy us. In 2014, we had Trans-Tasman Resources arrive in New Zealand, Aotearoa, and submit an application to mine 23 to 36 square kilometres of seabed for 35 years, using an invasive methodology never practiced before. At first, our government turned it down and sent them back to do some more work. They eventually withdrew, and to be honest, we were hoping that that was the end of that. But unfortunately, in 2016, the Trans-Tasman Resources came back. They resubmitted, and in 2017, their application to mine our seabed was approved by a split decision of a decision-making committee under our Ministry for Environment. We then decided that it was important to fight this and took the case to High Court. It was an extreme amount of energy and support, and as you can see from this shot, with a lot of community support and commitment. We won the case in 2018 alongside other parties such as Chasm. Trans-Tasman Resources then appealed to the Court of Appeal in 2019, and we won that case just recently, April in 2020. They are now appealing the Court of Appeal process to the Supreme Court. Despite us winning costs in court, this battle takes a huge toll on us as Indigenous people, as Māori. They have bottomless pockets, often act unethically, not recognising our rights, promising jobs and using situations like recently the COVID to promote their ability to create jobs in economic times of uncertainty. Their communications often have been divisive, and they have used racist strategies to appeal or put pressure on iwi when jobs are often scarce. Fortunately though, like in the story of David and Goliath, we have found the Achilles heel, which continuously causes the rejection to aspects of their arguments in courts. And we've also been able to find, in recent, the appeal court was able to find more wrongs and was considerably more damning. Yet despite winning 3 court cases, and despite going through this with 2 different governments, New Zealand's refused or hasn't taken a stand to intervene and ban seabed mining. And we need them now to take note, not of only how we feel, but also how the courts have proven is not right, and how we in the world, as Pacifica Whanonga, Pacifica relations, are faring. We're asking our government to be brave. We're also appealing that our intrinsic relationship with the ocean is better understood and taken into consideration that not a lot is known in our education system about the relationship that we have in the creation with the ocean. The toll on a small Indigenous group like ourselves is heavy, and we're in a people, I guess, often having to come back from the perils of loss of land and assets. And we would be much rather spending time on energy on developing education, better employment, and food and housing, and better health for our people. But like many Davids of the world, we are fortunate to have found great friends and support and network. We are an intergenerationally focused people. So many of our elders who started with us who have fallen have now children stepping up to continue this battle. And that's the role that we have as kaitiaki. It's a never-ending battle, and one that we would never think of walking away. I have a saying in my tribe, e koe mate, ka mate, ko te mate, which means we will never die. Even through death, we will be here. We will always be here to continue this battle. Kia ora, I appreciate your time.
Ralph, the floor is yours now.
Thank you, and greetings from Vanuatu. Vanuatu is an archipelago of 80 islands in the Southwest Pacific Ocean. We are an independent Pacific Island republic. So we are a Westminster democracy modeled on our colonizer, the UK. And I am a member of Parliament. And so what I want to talk about really is governance and how decisions are made about deep sea mining. We are, as Maureen, the moderator, said, on the forefront of the deep sea mining experiment in the Pacific Islands. I became Member of Parliament in 2008. And 5 years later, in 2013, I became the Minister of Lands, responsible for minerals, responsible for deep sea mining and onshore mining as well. And it was at that stage, in 2013, when I became the minister, that I discovered something very disconcerting, which was that in the previous 5 years in which I'd already been a Member of Parliament, something that I didn't know and which 99% of the population of Vanuatu did not know was that the government of Vanuatu had issued about 145 licenses for offshore mining exploration without the knowledge of Parliament. It had even gone without the knowledge of Cabinet. Minister had approved it. And needless to say, these licenses had been issued without any proper national regulatory framework for seabed mining or for scientific research, let alone any proper understanding of what the prospecting process entails, what lies on the seabed. And this, I think, is the common situation for all countries in the Pacific. We do not have any environmental baseline for the seabed that can be used in any environmental impact assessments. But what concerned me most as a legislator, as a policymaker, was that the government had been proceeding down this path of action without the people it is supposed to represent agreeing to or even knowing about what was happening. Further information on this, background information, you have the SPC, Sub-Pacific Community, SOPAC. These are regional organizations that assist Pacific Island countries to deal with issues of technical issues to do with seabed prospecting and mining and so on. And we've been receiving advice, but this didn't seem to be getting through to government officials or the level of the ministers. So what I did at that stage was just announce it to the public. I made a public announcement saying, we have this many licenses, it's been issued without our consent. And I announced that there would be a national consultation process to get people's views. And this is a point I want to emphasize, is that a process in which all the key stakeholder groups in the society, and in Vanuatu we're very fortunate in that we have a national constitution in which all land and sea resources are owned by traditional customary owners according to ancestral practice. This is legislated in the constitution, so it's safeguarded. And so the principle of free, prior, informed consent, which is contained in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, definitely applies in Vanuatu, which is pretty much a state which is 90-something% Indigenous. All the legislators like myself are Indigenous people. So we set about working with the key stakeholders in society, and in Vanuatu we have a situation where you have the National Council of Chiefs, National Council of Women, National Youth Council, Vanuatu Council of Churches, and so on. And we did a national consultation in 2015 about this issue, culminating in a big final national workshop on the issue of seabed mining and oceans policy. And what we came up with, what we discovered from this consultation, was that people in Vanuatu were very cautious, very cautious. In fact, the National Council of Women came out very strongly, totally opposed to any discussion of seabed mining, any discussion of even seabed prospecting. And in fact, at one stage, stopped attending and just boycotted the whole process. The National Council of Chiefs said, this may be something we're interested in, but we need to be very cautious. And a central priority was to protect ourselves by shaping effective legislation and policy. But there was a realization that the capability of government to maximize the benefits and minimize costs was something which people were very skeptical about. They were skeptical about the ability of government to act in the public interest when it came to issues such as seabed mining, which concerned revenue for the government versus perspectives of the communities who own the resources, that we had to have a very precautionary approach, protect what we already had, not lose anything we had, and gain from any such interventions. So based on that, we proceeded to develop an oceans policy. And in 2016, Vanuatu became the first country in the Pacific to launch a national oceans policy. And the national oceans policy was very much based on ideas of values associated that came out of our traditional culture concerning the values inherent in the environment that our ancestors had imbibed us with or imbued us with. And this approach that we need to make sure that any intervention does not reduce the benefits we already enjoy from economic, environmental, social benefits we enjoy from our resource in general, our seas, our lands, that we do not reduce or compromise those benefits by any interventions such as seabed mining. So what has happened now is that because of this consultation that we undertook, all of the exploration licenses have now lapsed. There is now a general view that we need to wait and see what happens, because as probably most of the people watching this will be aware, the first license ever granted for deep sea mining in the world was in Papua New Guinea. And now that has just, the company went bankrupt, the government invested, lost all its money. That whole thing is now gone under. And so in terms of deep sea mining being an experiment, so far it's failed in the only place where the license has been granted. And so we await to see whether there's going to be anything that happens that can prove us wrong in terms of this is an intervention which will reduce our access and benefit from the resource, which is our seas, our land, everything that lives in and on the sea and the land and above, which we have enjoyed for millennia. So I think, I suppose the takeaway from our experience is that it's important in undertaking these decisions to really consult widely and properly. And unfortunately, I think in most of our so-called Western democracies, this doesn't seem to happen. The process of consultation with communities and real people doesn't seem to happen, even though we say we're democracies. And as a member of parliament, I can say that because I come out of representative democracy, and it's not really representative. I know that. I know that we don't represent the people generally. So you really have to get out there and be really committed to making sure that there is really proper in-depth consultation to understand people's views. And what we found when we did that was that there is a lot of concern about what deep sea mining is. There's a lot of lack of understanding of why are we going out in the deep sea out there and going down to the bottom of the ocean to get something. What is that thing? Why are we going there? It's a very kind of, it doesn't really fit well with the cosmology of the indigenous people of Vanuatu. And myself, in my own position as a member of parliament, I will continue to rely on what the people tell me are their priorities. And so far, those priorities are, deep sea mining is not a priority. It's something that we may consider way down the track, but nothing that is relevant right now. And it seems like we may not need to go there. So it's a bit disconcerting for us to find out that other Pacific Island countries, which also are majority indigenous people countries, Cook Islands, Nauru, etc., are considering this path. And it makes me wonder what level of participation of ordinary people has there been in this decision by the governments to go down this path. And that is something that I would raise as a red flag for us, is that I think maybe if you go down to the people who live on the land, of the land, who've lived there for millennia, you will find that this view is not shared by ordinary people, and that governments are perhaps doing something that is not representative of the views of the people. And when you talk about governance and a society and how do we make decisions about what is best for society. If you don't have that level of consultation, then you're not really making decisions in the interest of the people for the people. And that is an issue that we need to be concerned about. So leaving aside all the environmental, social, economic, so-called aspects of deep sea mining, my concern is, do people really want this? Have we really asked people and made them aware of what the pros and cons and consequences of this are? And have we really taken into account their views? And I think if we do that, and I don't think it's been done, and if we have all the information available to us, for example, in the Pacific, we are making decisions without having an environmental baseline from which an environmental impact assessment can be calculated. Maybe we are just doing something that is just for revenue raising for a state, which in most Pacific Island countries is an extractive entity, which extracts from the people who live on the land. And it's not to do with what people actually want. And so that's sort of my perspective on that issue. Thank you very much, Maureen and colleagues.
Vinaka, Honourable Minister. And before I pass the floor to Matthias, if I could just encourage the audience, please post those written questions. I think it would be really great if we could get some Q&As questions up and running now. So you're welcome to start posting questions at this point. Matthias, over to you now.
Thank you very much, Maureen. So I don't see my slides right now, but they're coming. I'm running a European project looking at the environmental risks and impacts of deep sea mining. And so with my first slide, I just want to give a little introduction and what kind of resources we're actually talking about. So we have polymetallic nodules in the upper left that grow in abyssal plains. They contain copper, nickel, cobalt as interesting metals. About 3% of the nodules is of interest, the rest is waste. Then we have massive sulfides. They form from hydrothermal vents at mid-ocean ridges. And at least the interest for now is, thank God, the dead vents, because the active ones are really hotspots of life. And then as a third one, we have the ferromanganese crusts that grow on seamounts. And these two nodules and crusts are two-dimensional resources. So they are only at the seabed of just a few centimeters, maybe 10 or so. They are not going further down into depth. The only three-dimensional resource is really massive sulfides, but so far, content-wise, we only know the upper maybe 5 to 10 meters, but they extend down several hundreds of meters. In the lower right is a global map where you see where these three resources, exploration licenses or even mining licenses exist. Mining license at the moment only in economic zones of a few countries in the Pacific, for example, or here in the Atlantis too deep in the Red Sea. I will dwell now a little bit more on the licenses that are governed in the area by the International Seabed Authority in the Clarion-Clipperton Zone, which is here between Hawaii and the Mexican coast. So on the next slide, I have picked a few examples of megafauna that live in these nodule environments. So the nodules form actually a specific habitat for fauna in the deep sea. Nodule ecosystems support a highly diverse fauna of sessile and mobile fauna. Here you can see a few sessile fauna from corals, sea anemones, and then here's some mobile ones also. So sea cucumbers, for example, some little worms, but they are all associated to these nodule habitats. In this one, you can actually see that these sponges, for example, particularly the stalked sponges, form a specific habitat also for mobile fauna like this ophiuroid that you can see in this orange one. So this is depicted also in this upper graph here. The nodule fauna and the sessile fauna attached to the nodules form a specific habitat where also mobile fauna is associated to, and they need this habitat. And on the next slide, you can see that in this specific nodule habitat, there is higher abundance. In this case here, I show the megafauna compared to the normal seafloor without nodules, which is shown here. So it's a specific one. And it's true for the sessile fauna that you see here on the left, which is associated then to the nodules always, but also for the mobile fauna, as I just explained. And we looked in 2015 on cruises into old benthic impact experiments that had been done in the 90s in the Clarion Clipper and so on. So single tracks, a few 100-meter long and maybe 2 to 4 meter wide. Here you see the oldest one that is known in the CCZ, an old Omco track, a mining company that did some tests 40 years ago. This is located now in the French license area, this track, and it looks like it was drawn yesterday across the seafloor. So here for comparison, a very fresh one, 1 year old, which depicts quite nicely what we expect from nodule mining, that these upper 10 to 15 centimeters of the seafloor together with the nodules that are really lying next to each other is completely removed, including the fauna. And in the deep sea, this means all the myo, mega, macrofauna, and only a few microbes live below in the sediment. The rest is completely taken away because the nodules are lying so dense next to each other on the seabed. And if we look into these tracks on the next slide, you see that even after decades, the megafauna has not come back. And of course, the sessile fauna can't come back. The nodules are gone and removed, but also the mobile fauna is not going into these areas where now older sediment are exposed to the surface because they need these nodules as a habitat. So we have a loss of seafloor integrity that reduces population densities and also changes and reduces ecosystem functions. And that is true across numerous ecosystem compartments and functions. So on the next slide, I just summarize for nodule mining the main impact. So we have the removal of the sediment to seafloor at the top 10 centimeters with the nodules and its fauna. The collector systems, usually caterpillar systems, will create a sediment cloud just by driving over the seafloor. It's uncompacted sediment, but then also during the mining because they suspend the material completely that they're taking up. And so we will have not just an impact directly in the mining area, but these sediment clouds will drift with the bottom currents and slowly resettle. And will create an impact also outside the mined areas. And at the moment, from the knowledge that we have, we believe that this could be an impact area that is 2 to 5 times larger than the mined area itself. Then return waste of sediment is an issue. Basically, we had already answered that question 30 years ago, that this return plume should be injected right at the seabed and not somewhere in the water column, because then the impact in the water column will be even much larger. It could be half of the Pacific in a certain region. That's what modeling showed already 30 years ago. And then you might, of course, have accidental spread of these sediment plumes when these riser pipes have a failure or break. And this all leads to loss of habitat, loss of species, genetic diversity, ecosystem structure and functions, and it changes the surface sediment characteristics by the deposition of the particles, but also by the exposure of more compacted, reduced sediments to the seafloor, to the surface. And on the next slide, I have basically the question is, in UNCLOS it is defined in Article 145 that the ISA also has the task to protect the environment from harmful effects. And the question is, from an ecosystem point of view, how much is acceptable? So how can we avoid really larger scale impacts that go beyond individual mining areas, individual contract areas, even in, the CCZ as an area of contract areas. So we have to start thinking also about impacts that go across the Pacific, for example, because we know that several species are genetically connected across the entire Pacific. And what we need to avoid is these really large scale impacts. So we have to think not just about management plans in the contract areas, but also about management plans on global scale. I think that's something we need to start thinking about. And then, of course, it's the question, what as a global society are we, do we want to accept as an impact and loss of the environment? So it's a question to all of us. And that's also because in UNCLOS, it's defined that these resources on the seabed in the area are the common heritage of mankind. So it has not just a natural science part of the question, it's a societal question to all of us. And based on these findings that we have, we also made some recommendations for the ISA process and where they are drafting now the exploitation regulations. So at the moment, at least in the area that is governed by the International Seabed Authority, only exploration is allowed. Exploitation is currently not allowed because the regulations are not in place. And on the next slide, I'll just give a few overview recommendations that we've done in the past years from our project that you see here down an example of how environmental management and monitoring plans could look like. You have to think about reference zones, maybe not even just one, as it's currently often discussed, but you probably need several conservation and reference areas to compare your impact, because the main problem or question that we can't answer right now is spatial variability in the deep sea. Temporal variability, we basically don't know anything about. And we will also not have these answers in the next, I would say, decades, because we only have these point measurements. We don't have deep sea observatories with time sequence data on biodiversity, for example, community structures, and how that shifts and changes. We have that for current regimes. That's quite easy to do, but the rest we don't have because it would need a lot of effort and time and money to gather this information. So we need conservation areas, not just the areas of particular environmental interest that ISA has designed around the Clarion-Clipperton Zone. That's good. It's good that we have these large areas, but we also need them within license areas, so smaller parts set apart where mining will not take place that are also not impacted. That's important because this plume impact covers a larger area than just the mined area. And we need to think also about larger areas between license areas that are not set up right now to protect the abyssal biodiversity and protect the vulnerable ecosystems. We need to think about spatial management plans to minimize large-scale impacts, and not just, as I said, and what it's currently discussed for the exploitation regulations in ISA on a scale of Clarion-Clipperton Zone or individual license areas. I think we have to start thinking on a global plan. So how much if we really want to engage into deep sea mining and we think we need those metals, how much in the entire deep sea area we want to mine in the next 200 or 300 years. What is acceptable? So we need to come up with, as a scientist, we need to come up with indicators of ecosystem health and threshold values for these harmful effects. And at the moment, we may have them for a few individual points and questions, but not an overall picture of the ecosystem. We're far away from understanding that, because each time we get samples and new species on every cruise, so we cannot even say right now which are indicator species in the deep sea. So this is really complicated. Yeah, and basically with this, I would like to finish and thank you all for your attention.
Thank you, Matthias. And if I could just invite Saeed, our last panelist, to take the floor now.
Thank you, Maureen. I'll be very quick. Listening to the previous panelists, it almost goes without saying that there has to be a moratorium in place in respect of deep seabed mining. And at the very least, in the formation of a regulatory framework, free, prior, and informed consent, which is now so well established, either as performance standards in ILO 169 or in IFC Performance Standard 7, the ESF framework of the World Bank, Framework 7, all of that is supported by the jurisprudence emerging from the human rights treaty bodies. And at the very least, that must be incorporated. And then we need to be excessively vigilant, notwithstanding the comments that Debbie made about how difficult it is to keep filing in courts and how expensive it is for affected communities to do this. We must still persevere. The multilateral system is crumbling. It is under enormous strain. We must re-look and re-examine the way that it connects to the world of government. That very point of connection is now very weak. There's a sort of fecklessness about international organizations and how they're led and how willing or how determined they are to push the normative framework in the face of governments who themselves created it in the first place, but are delinquent when it comes to implementing it. And for this to succeed, we must work on having a broader activist community. In the world that I occupy, here in the US, the academic world, there's so many brilliant scientists, brilliant technical people, but not willing, as they should be the activists that we need to campaign on behalf of, the communities that are represented, by the governments of the Pacific Islands, or by traditional leaderships. And clearly, listening to Ralph and Debbie today, they need our support altogether. Finally, just one small point. These struggles must, how could I put this sort of politely? I was a government official for many years and then the human rights chief for the UN. Diplomatic niceties really don't work. There is confrontation at the level of grassroots societies, and they need the support of the rest of us. And so going back to the leadership of organizations, international organizations, there is where we need to also put the pressure. Because the mining industries and their supporters, their backers, their financial backers are extremely powerful. But we're working on, at least on the financial, so let's say the finance side, to try and make them think and illuminate their thinking about the very issues that Dr. Matthias just spoke about and that we heard from Ralph and Debbie earlier. So thank you for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here.
And with that, I think I will hand over quite aptly to Sean Owens, who will take us through the Q&A session at this point.
Thank you for that, Maureen, and thank you all for this incredible set of connected yet varied insights on the topic. We've received a number of questions, so I'm excited that we have another 15 or so minutes to field some of the questions. Please do keep the questions coming in as well, and if any questions that we are unable to address in the session, we will seek as partners to answer them separately later. Before I open the floor to questions, I would like to introduce, we have 3 additional experts in the wings. We have Joey Tao from Papua New Guinea, who's been working on the issue of seabed mining in the Pacific region for a number of years with the Pacific Alliance for Globalisation. We also have Duncan Curry, the Legal and Policy Advisor to the Deep Sea Conservation Coalition, and Matthew Gianni, co-founder, political and policy advisor to the Deep Sea Conservation Coalition. So the first question that I would like to pose, and this is directed to both Debbie and Ralph, can you share ideas on Pacific resistance and mobilizations that defend our ocean from exploitation like DSM, including Indigenous peoples' efforts? And I'm going to just request that you try and keep your answers succinct so that we can take a few questions in the time that we have. Thank you.
Well, I guess my answer, I was actually just going to write it in, is we spent a lot of time mobilising an education strategy while advocating the various entities within government. So our communities, as we were advocating and finding other common allies, such as CHASM, which is where we met Phil McCabe, which is Kiwis Against Mining, was to bring our grassroots in our communities with us so that they became more informed and the numbers grew, as did the resistance. And our community also, within that education strategy, put in cameras on our reefs to show where the mining was proposed actually had a lot of life, because there'd been a lot of disconnection. So we prepared videos, we were quite innovative in sharing our cultural intel as a snippet of what you got earlier. So there was, I guess, a whole community ownership, which was about a whole movement in itself. And that's created the stamina to continue the battle. And I guess also, you know, the court action was one way, but in doing that, we've continuously lobbied petitions, lobbied the various governments. As I said, we've had a few during this 6 years, petitions. But most important to us was creating, as the speaker said earlier, was creating a very aggressive and extensive education program across the sectors within our communities, from the youth within the schools to our elderly. So that's here.
There are local organisations in all Pacific Island countries who are working to raise awareness with communities on these issues. And most of these local organisations are in regional networks. And Maureen, for example, is head of Pacific Network on Globalisation, which is one of those networks. But these are the things that need to be supported to make sure that the awareness gets to communities so they understand the issues and can make informed decisions and can request their decision makers at, you know, policy level, councillors, members of parliament, leaders, can demand appropriate responses based on their understanding. It's really a matter of working with local communities to raise their awareness so they can be much better advocates for what they really think about these issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those answers. The next question that we'll field, and I'm actually going to try and put two together. We have one question that says, it is good that the issue of consultation and free prior informed consent of affected peoples has been highlighted. Are you confident that Pacific peoples will get independent information to give that informed consent? How can people be better informed? So that is directed to Zaid, but I would add to that, there's an additional question on consultation. Thank you for a very insightful and inspiring panel. Could the panelists share their views on seabed mining beyond national jurisdiction? If proper community engagement and consultation is already so difficult on the national level, how can this be realized on the international level? How can the interests of potentially affected communities be safeguarded, if at all?
On this question, it is a bedeviling issue, because where we see a breakdown in the consultative process, it's exactly on that point that the affected community doesn't have at its disposal the sorts of information where it can question the very narrative provided to them by the, let's say, that particular body that's conducting the consultative process. In many cases, it's a government agency, and sometimes abetted by the corporation that is affected. it requires the extra vigilance by the rest of us, and supporting the indigenous communities is absolutely necessary. The problem is that we have cowardice is rampant across the globe, unfortunately. And we don't have the levels of confrontation which we need when it comes to the corporate world from others who should be helping the affected communities. And many will speak in committee quite bravely. The question is, are they willing to sacrifice a little bit of what they represent or what they are in defense of the rights of others? And here, unfortunately, we have a woeful state when it comes to political leadership around the world, absolutely dreadful. And now we have these critical issues where, in a very existential sort of sense, the affected communities of the Pacific, and now beyond that, the rest of us are imperiled. And so we need to sort of think in a way where we connect all of this together. Just a final point here. One of the problems we have from a human rights side, because this is really a human rights issue, is that we don't marry up all our efforts. We're very cellular, so, indigenous peoples have to fend for themselves. Peoples, the African descendants or Afro-descendants have to defend for themselves. The LGBTI community have to defend for themselves. We're not there defending each other. How can I expect anyone to support me if I'm not willing to support them? And we see now, and I live in Harlem in New York, and we see this amazing support for Black Lives Matter. I mean, amazing. And this should be the norm everywhere. And that's what we need to do. And if we did this, then we would make it easier for the affected communities to understand what their rights are, and also to understand what the up-to-date scientific knowledge about the consequences of such action as DSM has on their lives. And they need to be supported by a whole fleet of lawyers around the world that are willing to use the jurisdictions available to them and to file on their behalf and help and do pro bono work, and not make it expensive for affected communities to do the sorts of things that Debbie said her community was doing so bravely and courageously.
Thank you, Zaid. Did any of the other panelists want to speak to these questions as well?
Just on the question of areas beyond national jurisdiction, for small countries in the Pacific, this is where we really depend on these multilateral organizations like the International Seabed Authority, the Pacific Islands Forum. We can't really do anything by ourselves. We need to work with the other countries in the Pacific, the other countries in the world. And that's where we depend on these multilateral organizations. And this is where we are disheartened by the reality that Zaid talked about, which is that these institutions are kind of diminishing as to what they were. And we get very concerned about that, because without them, Vanuatu is one of 200 countries in the world, a very tiny state. What are we going to? What level of impact or can we have on this decision? We've got to act together, and so we rely on entities like the Pacific Islands Forum, to groupings of states, maybe AOSIS, Association of Small Island States, to try and come up with common positions that we can push in these agencies. And this is very difficult. It's very difficult to get these consensus at this international level. But unfortunately, that's the only way we can deal with these issues beyond our national jurisdiction.
Thank you very much, Ralph. I have a question that came in from Matthias. Given the amount of data still lacking, do you think the ISA can realistically be expected to devise adequate environmental regulations and standards now as part of exploitation regulations that are future-proof?
Yeah, so that is of course difficult to write down now very explicit, detailed regulations. But in the Western world, at least in Europe, governmental agencies for regulations are used to that. So that there are ways of doing that, and Zaid is already nodding. So you have to have, in the end, adaptive ones that as soon as more knowledge comes and we know better what the impacts are, that you can adapt these regulations. So it's not an unknown legal tool, I would say. Maybe Saif want to say a little bit more on that.
No, you're exactly right. I'm fully supportive.
Thank you very much for that. So we have another question. Can the political decision taken in the Pacific influence decisions in other parts of the world? I'll leave that open to whoever would like to take that one.
I'll start by saying, I'm just repeating what I said earlier. If Pacific Island states come together, get a common position, push it in the ISA, for example, of course we can influence the general DSM debate, right? By being a joint force, substantial force. If, for example, the SIDS were to take on this one position. So it's a matter of this international work, collaboration, agreeing on positions, and then taking them to these bodies like the ISA in particular. Definitely we can influence the debate on DSM. But this is something that needs to happen. And unfortunately, I agree with what Said said, that sometimes as a political leader myself, political leadership is very lacking.
Thank you, Ralph. I would like to invite Joey or Maureen to weigh in on this question.
I think the Pacific Island countries and peoples have historically, particularly on ocean issues, taken very strong leadership, whether it's been on nuclear testing, for instance, or deep sea fishing, or drift net fishing campaigns, global issues, Pacific leaders, and climate change, for instance, the climate emergency. We Pacific peoples and governments have really demonstrated that we can take these types of global issues and bring moral authority consistently. So I think we do have history and experiences, but the DSM issue has divided many of our countries. Obviously, there's a couple of our countries that are very pro, but as Ralph has clearly pointed out, if you go right down to the people's level across the Pacific, you will find very strong support for moratorium, and even much more stronger than that, and a call to halt deep sea mining. So I think we have established historical wins on the backs of governments like Pacific Island governments.
Thank you for that, Maureen. Joey, did you have anything to add to that before we move into the closing remarks?
I mean, just wanted to touch in with what Zayed talked about, the importance of free, prior, informed consent. And I think it's one important aspect of the whole process of consultation. I could just take you back to Papua New Guinea's experience, where a lot of exploration licenses or permits were issued without proper or lack of consultation with local communities in the Bismarck Sea. So I think speaking widely and tying in line with what the Honorable Opposition Leader from Vanuatu stressed was the importance of consultation, which when he was minister then, made sure that there was a consultation or an extensive consultation with communities and key groups, be it churches, women's groups, or young people. And I think that's some of the things that other groups in the Pacific are trying to call for, these extensive consultations, ensuring that people are properly informed, their consents are given, and they have the right to challenge such decisions.
Thank you for that, Joey, and to all of the panelists and to all of those you who sent in questions. I'm going to hand back over to Maureen to close the session now.
It's been a real privilege to moderate this panel, and I think the take-home messages are quite vibrant. I think it really pushes two distinct worldviews that we have to resolve. The questions of what is appropriate, clear signals from the Pacific about the role, the sacredness of the ocean. If it is your story of origin, the message to the global community is very clear. Pacific people say no to deep sea mining. There are challenges for the ISA on its role around protective and protective measures. It is no longer appropriate for a body that's responsible for a vast jurisdiction holding in its place the global commons on behalf of everyone, that they have to pay very particular attention. The call to be brave, to take action, whether at a government level, multilateral institutions, that we need to combine all of our efforts if we are to deal with deep sea mining in ways that are similar with kinds of movements that are growing all over the world. But I think we are at a watershed moment. We have laws, normative frameworks that can allow us to explore beyond what we think we're capable of right now. And I think the challenge rests with all of us. The questions really promote and provoke this notion that we still need public discussions and debates, and to see how we can mobilize and move together. And I think that's just a very poor way of summarizing, but I just want to say it's been well worth it. And I think the message to the organizers is we need another public forum to take this forward. So on behalf of the team, Sean, Joey, Duncan, Matthew, Phil, Jessica, to our panelists, Ralph, Debbie, Zaid, Matthias, we hope we can stay in touch. And to our audience, we are available. You've got our emails. You can connect with us, and we should really, really continue this conversation. Thank you all for staying up late in the Southern Hemisphere, and to you in the Northern Hemisphere, a very productive afternoon, and thank you all.